On this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast, top 5 myths about the Freddie Mac Exclusionary List.
Welcome to the Crushing Debt Podcast with your host, Florida attorney Sean Yesner, where our goal is to help you get rid of the financial bullies in your life.
So welcome back to this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast. My name is Sean Yesner, owner and founder of Yesner Law, and it's been a while since I've done a podcast episode about the Freddie Mac Exclusionary List, and I've been getting a few calls about it recently, so I thought I'd do another episode here and talk about something I haven't really talked about before, which are the top 5 myths about coming off of the Freddie Mac Exclusionary List. Now, before I get there, a little bit of background. So you can hear all about the Freddie Mac Exclusionary List on the Yesner Law blog, which you can get to by going to the website, yesnerlaw.com. I've also got a couple of different podcast episodes that can give you a little bit of primer on the Freddie Mac Exclusionary List, specifically episodes 262, 179, 134, 132, 83, and 32. So I have been talking about the exclusionary list on and off throughout the life of the Crushing Debt Podcast, but I wanted to talk about the top 5 myths about the exclusionary list on this show. So what is the exclusionary list? Well, basically, the exclusionary list is a list that Freddie Mac keeps, and if you find yourself on that list, you cannot participate in a real estate transaction where Freddie Mac is a party. Now, admittedly, mostly, this applies to realtors, mortgage originators, title companies, title attorneys, appraisers, inspectors. I've even got a mobile notary off of the list before. But this can really apply to anybody. It could apply to real estate investors. It could really apply to anybody. And what being on the list does is it prevents you from participating in a real estate transaction. So if you're a mortgage originator and you're on the list, you cannot originate a Freddie Mac loan. If you're a realtor and you're on the list, you cannot get a commission. You cannot represent a buyer or a seller where Freddie Mac is a party to the closing. If you're a title company, you cannot do the closing if Freddie Mac is a party, buyer or seller. So if you're paying off a Freddie Mac loan, if the lender is giving the buyer a Freddie Mac loan and you're a title company, you cannot do that closing under Freddie Mac's guidelines. But I've seen it apply even further than that. I've seen situations where we have an investor who ends up on the Freddie Mac exclusionary list and then tries to finance or refinance property in his or her personal name, and Freddie Mac says, no, we're not going to give you a loan because you are on the list. I've seen realtors and mortgage originators who end up on the list who try to finance or refinance the purchase of a home, and Freddie Mac says, no, because you're on the list, we're not going to give you a Freddie Mac loan. So being on the list has implications beyond whether you happen to be in a real estate career or not. If you find yourself on the list, you cannot get a Freddie Mac loan. Now, over the years, we've been able to get lots of people off of the list. And so we will write a letter to Freddie Mac on your behalf. We'll add whatever supporting documentation that you can provide. We'll make the best argument to Freddie Mac to get you off the list. And we've been successful. We've been successful more often than not in getting people off the list. Now, admittedly, we have been unsuccessful. We've submitted applications where Freddie Mac has said, no, this person is not coming off the list. So we are not 100% effective. But again, we've gotten more people off the list than not. And this is something that I've brought my associate attorney on board, Lauren, to help with. And so both of us are now writing letters and submitting packages and applications to Freddie Mac to get people off the list. And we've both been successful and we've both been unsuccessful. But again, overall, both of us have been more successful than not in helping people get off the list. And so if you find yourself on the list, or if you know somebody who's on the Freddie Mac exclusionary list, have them contact us. This is something that we can help people regardless of where they're located, whether they're located in Florida or not, wherever they are in the country. We've been able to help people come off of the Freddie Mac exclusionary list. So have them listen to this episode, have them listen to some of the other episodes that I've done on the Crushing Debt podcast about the exclusionary list, have them check out our blog. and I will link the blog post that this episode is based on within the notes of the show notes here. So if you have questions about the exclusionary list, I've definitely got a ton of resources through the Yesner Law website, through the Crushing Debt podcast, to help you come off the list. But what I wanted to talk about today was the top 5 myths surrounding the Freddie Mac exclusionary list. And so what I understand, or what I hear in talking to clients, is that there are a ton of myths surrounding getting on the list or being on the list. And so I wanted to debunk a couple of those myths. Now, real quick, before I get there, I do want to mention our sponsor, Sam Cohen. Those of you that are longtime listeners know that Sam sponsors the show in exchange for these plugs on the show. We have a fantastic relationship with Sam and Attorneys First Insurance. They write errors and omissions, or E&O insurance, all over the country. Specifically, they're focusing on Florida and Texas, I know right now. But really, if you need errors and omissions insurance, or malpractice coverage, as it's called, contact Sam at Attorneys First Insurance, regardless of where you're located, as long as you are an attorney or title company. Those are the only companies that he writes malpractice insurance for. But if you are an attorney or a title company, definitely reach out, Sam at attorneysfirst.com or www.attorneysfirst.com. Or if you really want to support the show and you know an attorney or title company that's due to renew their malpractice insurance, definitely go ahead and send them over to Sam at attorneysfirst.com or www.attorneysfirst.com. He is a longtime friend of the show, longtime supporter of the show and the law firm, a longtime supporter of a lot of the things that I've done here throughout my career, a vendor of mine, a friend of mine, a mentor of mine. So definitely I want to do what I can to support Sam and Attorneys First. So let's get into the top 5 myths surrounding the Freddie Mac exclusionary list. The first thing on the list: being on the list means I've committed a crime. That is a myth, and that is untrue. Now, if you've been found to commit a crime, and that crime does harm to Freddie Mac, then you can get on the list. So committing a crime in the real estate sphere is something that can get you on the list. I haven't seen anyone go on the list if they've committed, like, for example, a DUI. I haven't seen that as a reason that Freddie Mac would put someone on the list. But if they've committed a real estate fraud, banking fraud, something along those lines, title fraud, that is definitely something that could get you on the list. But the myth here is that being on the list means I've committed a crime, and that's not necessarily true. I've seen people get on the list without committing crimes, as long as what they've done is something that has brought harm or could bring harm to the Freddie Mac origination process, the Freddie Mac servicing process, the ability of Freddie Mac to take on or buy or sell the loan. So if someone has done something that's caused harm to Freddie Mac, regardless of whether that is a crime or not, we'll get them on the list. But just because someone is on the list does not mean they've committed a crime. Now, I've seen situations where other governmental agencies have investigated based on what Freddie Mac has said. So I've seen situations where an attorney got put on the list and Freddie Mac forwarded the information to the state bar. I've seen situations where the FBI has made an inquiry into some mortgage process, found that there was no crime committed, and cleared the person that they were investigating, but still Freddie Mac put them on the list because Freddie Mac thought in those circumstances that what was being investigated was enough to bring harm to Freddie Mac to put them on the list. So, again, I've seen governmental agencies research this kind of stuff and not accuse somebody of committing a crime, not indict someone for committing a crime, but that still gets the person on the Freddie Mac exclusionary list. But it doesn't necessarily work the other way around. Just because someone is on the list does not mean they've committed any type of crime. So that's why I'm saying that being on the list means I've committed a crime is a myth about being on the Freddie Mac exclusionary list. The second myth that I've got here: Freddie Mac shares my information with other lenders. Again, that is not true, and Freddie Mac says in their materials that the list is confidential and not to be shared with anybody else. So Freddie Mac does not share your information with other lenders. Now, what happens is, if you're on the Freddie Mac list and the loan is being originated, let's say through Wells Fargo, and so Wells Fargo searches the Freddie Mac Exclusionary List in order to issue you a Freddie Mac loan, or you're a mortgage originator or realtor, whatever, and Wells Fargo runs you through the Freddie Mac Exclusionary List, and they see that you're on the list. Well, now Wells Fargo says, we're not going to do any type of Wells Fargo program loan with you. So because we being Wells Fargo, now knows that you're on the Freddie Mac Exclusionary List, we're not going to allow you to do a Fannie Mae loan. We're not going to allow you to do an FHA loan. We're not going to allow you to do a conventional loan. So it's not that Wells Fargo is sharing this information with anybody else, and it's not like Freddie Mac is sharing this information with anybody else. But I've seen situations where the bank says, oh, you're on the list for Freddie Mac, so we're not going to give you a loan from our bank, or we're not going to allow you to write a loan from our bank. And so it's not necessarily that the information is being shared between lenders, it's that the lender will find out what's going on and not want to write the loan with any of their programs. But for that reason, I think that saying that Freddie Mac shares my information with other lenders is a myth of the Freddie Mac exclusionary list. The third myth that I hear a lot is that the list will expire. And unfortunately, this is a myth. Being on the list does not expire. There is no statute of limitations. There is no statute of repose. There is no expiration date. If you're on the list today and you never ask to come off the list, you will still be on the list a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now. There is no expiration date to the list. You do have to proactively ask to come off the list. Now, what happens is the more time that goes by, obviously two things happen. Number one, the more time that goes by, the more opportunity you have to do things that will show Freddie Mac that you should come off the list. And a lot of times what we like to do in our letters is tailor the things that you've done since being on the list to the things that got you on the list. So, for example, if what got you on the list was a borrower that submitted falsified documents, and you let those documents go through, and they get through to underwriting, and they learn that the documents are false, and they put you on the list. Well, if it's been 10 years since you've been on the list, well, let's talk about all the processes and systems you've put in place to catch borrowers that submit falsified documents. And that way we can have 10 years of content, in my made-up example here, to show people why, or to show Freddie Mac why you've learned your lesson, you're not going to cause harm to Freddie Mac, and you're going to do things specifically geared towards why you got on the list in order to help you get off the list. So that's the first thing, is the amount of time. And the second thing is, again, just based on the passage of time, we can include more different types of evidence, like you have the opportunity to take more continuing education. We have the opportunity to show Freddie Mac, for example, if you're a mortgage originator and you've been on the list for 10 years, well, in that 10 years, you've generated non-Freddie Mac closings of X billions of dollars. I mean, at its heart, Freddie Mac wants to make a profit. And if the more loans, the more good loans that it can originate, the more profit that Freddie Mac makes. And so if we can show that over these 10 years that you've been on the list, you've generated all these good loans, that will also help your application to come off the list. So again, it's not like there's a statute of limitations. It's not like after a certain period of time you fall off the list, but certainly the longer you've been on the list, the more evidence that we can generate, the more evidence that we can gather, the more evidence that we can show to Freddie Mac that shows why you should come off the list. Now, this is a terrible, terrible example, especially given myth number one, that being on the list means I've committed a crime. But the best analogy that I can think of for being on the list is sort of probation. So when somebody has committed a crime and is asking to go on probation, they don't necessarily argue why being convicted of that crime was wrong. What they do is they argue all the good stuff they've done since being convicted that shows that they've rehabilitated and that they should go on parole. It's a terrible example because of myth number one, that being on the list means I've committed a crime, but it's the best analogy that I've been able to think of for how you can come off the list. And so again, being on the list does not necessarily mean you've committed a crime, but based on that analogy, I would not necessarily argue why someone should not be on the list. Instead, what I would argue is all the great stuff that they've done since being on the list that shows that they are no longer a threat to Freddie Mac's origination process. And so, therefore, the more time someone has been on the list, the more opportunity they have to create and gather evidence that shows why they should come off the list. Things like all the great stuff they've done, all the great loans they've been a part of since being on the list. All the processes and procedures they've put in place, all the education they've taken, all the education that they've provided. And so one huge thing that I think is a great benefit to a Freddie Mac exclusionary list application is to show that you've not only taken continuing education in your field geared towards the things that got you on the list, but also that you've given education to other people through qualified education programs, not just that you had a chat with somebody, but that through your realtor organization, mortgage organization, attorney organization, whatever, you've provided continuing education credit classes to people geared towards some of the things that got you on the list. That would be huge to show why you should come off the list. And again, the more time that's passed, the more opportunity you've had to do a lot of that stuff, to show a lot of that evidence to Freddie Mac. The fourth myth here, I was put on the list without due process. I didn't know I was on the list. I got on the list and then I didn't know it until X years later, 2 years later, 5 years later, 10 years later, where some lender told me that I was on the list and I couldn't be in the transaction. And so I have no due process here. That is, in every case I've ever experienced, a total myth. Now, typically what happens is Freddie Mac will issue you a letter that says, for XYZ reasons, we're going to put you on the list unless within 21 days you tell us why you should not be on the list. Now, I've had a couple of those come through in my career here in trying to get people off the Freddie Mac list. I've had a few instances where someone has come to me and said, hey, I got this letter from Freddie Mac, and in 21 days I'm going to go on the list. And we've rushed to put packages together and made our best arguments to Freddie Mac. In those cases, I am completely unsuccessful. I have not yet prevented anyone from going on the list. Now, they've been the minority, I think 2 or 3 of the dozens of times we've asked people to get people off the Freddie Mac list. 2 or 3 times they've come to us when they've gotten their letter that says, hey, within 21 days we're going to go on the list. And unfortunately, so far we are not successful in keeping those people off the list. And once you go on the list, you have to be on the list for 2 years before you can ask to come off. So once you go on that list, you can't do anything about it for at least 2 years. But again, everybody gets that letter. Now, where some people say, I never got due process. Let's say that they're a mortgage originator and they did something that Freddie Mac says, we're going to put you on the list. But by the time that letter gets to them, they've moved to another lender or moved to a bank, or gone from lending to being a realtor, or gone from lending to being some other type of profession unrelated to real estate. Well, all Freddie Mac knows is the last address that you were at when you did whatever it was you did to get you on the list. So the letter will go to that last address. And just because you're not there doesn't mean Freddie Mac didn't send it. And again, in every circumstance, Freddie Mac will give you 21 days to tell them why you should not go on the list. So in terms of due process, a lot of times people don't get the letter is because they've moved and they never told Freddie Mac because they never thought they had to. I've had people that have ignored the letter, not understood what that 21-day letter was from Freddie Mac, a whole bunch of different situations. But I think the argument that I never got my due process would rarely work. It would have to be an extremely unique set of circumstances. And I've even heard of some cases where before issuing that letter that Freddie Mac intends to put you on the list, Freddie Mac has sent out somebody to investigate or talk to you or research, the situation and the facts and the circumstances. And so certainly if you were talking to somebody from Freddie Mac and then you got a letter and you never responded to that letter, this argument of a lack of due process is why I think that's a myth. In other words, saying I was put on the list without due process is, in every case I've ever seen, a myth. And so that's why it's included on this list. Last but not least, being on the list means I can't do closings. So my fifth myth here, being on the list means I can't do closings. Again, it's a myth. What being on the list means is that you cannot do Freddie Mac closings. It doesn't mean you can't do closings. So what types of closings could you do? You could do cash closings. You could do hard money lender closings. You could do Fannie Mae closings. You could do FHA, VA, conventional. The only types of closings you can't do are Freddie Mac loan closings. Now again, going back to myth number 2, Freddie Mac shares my information with other lenders. Like I explained with that myth, if you're on the list and Wells Fargo sees that you're on the list and Wells Fargo says, we're not going to let you do a Fannie Mae loan because you're on the Freddie Mac list, well, maybe you might want to go to Chase. And the interesting issue here is that every lender searches the list, but every lender doesn't do it consistently, in my experience, and every lender doesn't catch it, in my experience. And so, theoretically, if you're on the Freddie Mac list, you shouldn't do any type of Freddie Mac loan, whether you're going to borrow, originate, be a realtor, whatever. You shouldn't do any Freddie Mac loan. But again, I think the onus here is on the lender. And so again, if you went to Wells Fargo and Wells Fargo said you're on the Freddie Mac list, we're not going to write any type of program loan for you, maybe you should go to Chase. Maybe you should go to Bank of America. Maybe you should go to an unconventional lender, a subprime lender. Maybe you should go to a conventional lender. Maybe you should go to a VA lender. Maybe you should go to a different lender other than the one that said that you're on the list. Maybe you should only do cash deals or hard money deals. In fact, I remember a situation where, going back to myth number 3, the list will expire. I had a client once who was on the Freddie Mac list for years, 10, 12, 15 years, something like that. And in that period of time, had really only done, it was a realtor, had really only done cash closings, but high-end cash closings. And so part of our argument to Freddie Mac is that, hey, this guy is originating tons of closings, and Freddie Mac is getting none of that lending business because he has to do all cash deals. But we've learned our lesson. We've cleaned up our processes. Here's all the reasons we should come off the list. And hey, Freddie Mac, as a bonus, if you take us off this list, we can originate more loans. We can send more buyers your way to make new loans. And so this guy had done billions of dollars of cash deals. And so part of our appeal to Freddie Mac was, hey, you can get a piece of those deals. We don't have to do just cash transactions if you take this client off the list. Now, again, there were other reasons, better reasons that he should have come off the list. This was just sort of the gravy or the icing on the cake to say, hey, you, Freddie Mac, you can get a piece of all of this lending action. We don't have to limit ourselves anymore to cash deals if you take this client off the list. And in that situation, it was successful. So if you find yourself on the Freddie Mac list, again, reach out to us, contact us. Let us see if we can talk to you and help you come off the list. If you've seen any myths other than these 5, let me know. and let me see, maybe we can do a follow-up episode or a follow-up blog, and we can talk about, other myths about being on the Freddie Mac list that you've seen. But again, for purposes of today's episode, the top 5 myths about being on the Freddie Mac Exclusionary List. Number 1, being on the list means I've committed a crime. Number 2, Freddie Mac shares my information with other lenders. Myth number 3, the list will expire. Myth number 4, I was put on the list without due process. And finally, myth number 5, being on the list means I can't do closings. And again, I wrote a blog article about why all these things are myths. This podcast episode describes why all these things are myths. And some of them may be partially true, but for the most part, they are all myths. If you've seen any others, please let me know. I'd love to investigate it. I'd love to look at it. I'd love to talk about why it may or may not be a myth. If you're on the list or know someone on the list, please reach out. We can help you potentially come off the list and talk to you about all the different things we can do in that regard. But I think that will do it for this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast. Like I say at the end of every episode, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. We hope that at the end of the month you have more money rather than at the end of the money you have more month. That'll do it for this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast, and we look forward to talking to you in next week's episode.
If you have questions that you think would make a great topic for a future episode, please email Sean or connect with us on social media. Sean Yesner and Yesner Law, PL, are Florida licensed attorneys. The information contained in this week's episode is not a substitute for legal advice. Your situation may differ, especially if you are located somewhere other than the state of Florida. If you have questions, please contact our office or contact a local attorney. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast.